You check your phone before your feet touch the floor. 6 missed notifications. None of them from anyone who loves you. You scroll anyway. Somewhere between the second and third app, you forget what you were even looking for. Your coffee goes cold in the other room. This is not an accident. It is not a personal failing you can fix with a better morning routine or a stricter bedtime. It is the result of a life built to keep you reaching, checking, refreshing, never quite arriving. You work to pay for things you use to recover from work. You call this normal because everyone around you calls it normal too. But normal is not the same as necessary. And somewhere underneath the noise you already know the difference. What follows will not tell you to quit your job or move to the woods. That would be easy to dismiss and easier to ignore. What follows will ask you a harder question. What would your days look like if you actually decided how to spend them, instead of discovering how they were spent, the way you discover a bank balance after the money is already gone? Here is the part that will unsettle you. You have been told your whole life that the busy life is the full life, that accumulation is the same as achievement. But a man once walked into the woods with an axe and came out having proven the opposite. And the proof he left behind still works on anyone brave enough to read it honestly. The question is not whether you have time. The question is what you have been spending it on, and whether you would recognize your own life if you finally stopped to look at it. Based on the book Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The First Sign. Where the disorder begins quietly, before it has a name. It begins before you notice it beginning. You have a Sunday afternoon with nothing scheduled. Somehow it is gone by 4 o'clock, and you cannot say where. Not to a nap, not to a conversation, not to anything you would call rest. It slipped through your hands the way water does when you try to hold it without a cup. You sit on the edge of the couch and feel a small, specific unease, the kind you don't mention to anyone because it sounds ungrateful to complain about a free afternoon. But the unease is real. Something in you already knows that a life built entirely of these afternoons will add up to nothing you chose. This is the first sign, and it rarely looks dramatic. Nobody collapses under the weight of a wasted Sunday. The signal is quieter than that. It shows up as a mild irritation when someone asks what you did this weekend, and you find yourself inventing an answer more interesting than the truth. It shows up when you buy something you don't need, and feel a flicker of relief followed almost immediately by a flatter, duller feeling that has no name. It shows up in the extra 10 minutes you spend in the car before going inside. Not because you're tired, but because inside is one more room where nothing is fully yours. Consider the man who first put this feeling into words with total precision. Henry Thoreau did not walk into the woods because he hated people or wanted to escape them. He walked in because he had done the arithmetic most of us refuse to do, and the numbers frightened him. He counted the days a man works to earn the money for a house, and he counted the years of a life those days consume, and he asked the plainest question a person can ask. Is the trade worth it? Not in theory. Not as a thought experiment for a philosophy class. In the actual currency of hours that do not come back. You have already done a version of this arithmetic without realizing it. You know somewhere below the surface at how many hours of work bought your car, your subscriptions, the clothes hanging unworn in your closet. You know it, and you don't know it. The way a person knows their weight without stepping on the scale. The knowledge sits there, available, uncomfortable, easy to avoid checking. Here is the distinction that changes everything, and it is the kind of distinction the rest of this narrative will keep returning to. There is a difference between a busy life and a full one. Busy is a schedule with no empty space in it. Full is a life where the space that exists, empty or occupied, was placed there on purpose. A calendar can look identical from the outside and be either one on the inside. Two people can work the same job, live in the same neighborhood, raise children on the same street, And one of them is living a chosen life, while the other is living a life that happened to them. From the outside, you cannot tell the difference. From the inside, the difference is everything. This is where the first sign becomes dangerous if it goes unnamed, because the mind is remarkably good at converting discomfort into distraction before you get a real look at it. The unease from that lost Sunday afternoon doesn't sit still long enough to be examined. It gets absorbed by the next notification, the next errand, the next small purchase that promises a feeling it cannot actually deliver. You never quite stop long enough to ask the question underneath the unease, whose life is this, and did I build it? Or did it build itself around me while I was looking somewhere else? Thoreau built himself a small structure at the edge of a pond, and did something almost nobody around him was doing. He stopped to look. Not for a weekend retreat. Not for a curated break from real life that he'd later post about. He went to actually examine what real life required, stripped of everything assumed. He wanted to know with his own hands and his own hours what a person genuinely needs in order to live, as opposed to what a person has simply been told to want. That distinction, need versus want, sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Almost nobody applies it honestly to their own life. You already know this, because if someone handed you your monthly spending and asked you to circle what you truly needed, you would hesitate over more items than you'd like to admit. Picture a Tuesday evening. Nothing special about it. You're standing in front of an open refrigerator that has food in it, but you close it and order something instead. Not because you're actually hungry for anything specific, because ordering feels like doing something, and doing something feels better than sitting in a kitchen with nothing scheduled and nothing demanding your attention. That 15-second decision at the refrigerator door is not really about food. It's about your relationship with unstructured time, and whether you trust yourself inside it. This is not a moral failing. Nobody handed you a manual for how to live inside empty time and use it well. You were handed a culture that fills every gap automatically, so efficiently that you rarely notice the gap was ever there to begin with. The disorder isn't that you're weak. The disorder is that you were never taught to notice the trade you're making hour by hour, purchase by purchase, scroll by scroll. There is a further distinction worth making here, because it will keep the first sign from being mistaken for something smaller than it is. Attention and distraction are not opposites in the way people usually assume. Attention is a resource you spend on purpose, aimed at something you actually chose to look at. Distraction is not the absence of attention. It is attention spent on autopilot, aimed by whatever happens to be loudest in the moment, rather than by anything you decided mattered. You can spend an entire evening looking directly at a screen and never once have paid real attention to anything on it. The eyes were open. The choosing was absent. This matters because the first sign rarely arrives as an obvious crisis. It arrives as a long string of evenings where attention got spent without ever being chosen, each one small enough to seem harmless, until the string of them adds up to a life that has been, in the most literal sense, unattended, not neglected by anyone else, unattended by the one person who actually had standing to attend to it. So here is where the first sign leaves you, standing at the edge of something you haven't named yet. Not blame, not a demand that you burn your life down and move to a pond tomorrow morning. Just a question, placed quietly where you can't avoid it anymore. When was the last time an entire day belonged to you, on purpose, from the moment you woke up to the moment you closed your eyes? If you can't answer that easily, you already have your answer. That coffee is still cold in the other room. The only real question left is whether you're going to walk back in and drink it anyway, out of habit, or whether you're finally going to notice that it went cold while you weren't paying attention to your own life. Chapter 2. The Functional Denial. The precise, unglamorous mechanics of not seeing what you already know. You know a friend who is clearly unwell in their job, drained in a way that shows on their face before they ever say a word about it, And yet, when you ask how work is going, they say it's fine. Not once. Every time. You've stopped believing the word and started translating it in real time. Fine meaning something closer to unbearable. Tolerated. You do this without judgment. You understand the translation because you speak the same language. You have said fine about things that were not fine, and you have said it with a straight face, and you have almost believed it yourself while saying it. This is not lying. Not exactly. Lying requires knowing the truth and choosing to hide it. What you and your friend are doing is stranger and more useful to examine, because it protects something. Psychologists call versions of this cognitive dissonance, but the term is too clinical for what it actually feels like from inside a body. What it feels like is survival. If you look directly at how much of your week goes to something that drains you, and how little goes to anything that fills you back up, you would have to do something about it. And doing something about it is expensive, frightening, uncertain. So instead, a quieter mechanism takes over. You don't see the problem, not because you're incapable of seeing it, but because seeing it would cost more than you're currently willing to pay. This is the functional denial, and it is not stupidity. It is closer to intelligence misapplied, a mind protecting itself from a conclusion it isn't ready to act on. Thoreau understood this mechanism a century and a half before anyone gave it a clinical name. He watched the men around Walden Pond, farmers who had inherited land along with the debt attached to it, and he described them as living lives of quiet desperation, a phrase so often repeated now that it has nearly lost its edge. Say it slower and the edge comes back. Quiet. Not loud desperation, not the kind that announces itself and gets addressed. Quiet desperation is the kind that gets managed instead of solved, the kind that becomes so familiar it stops registering as desperation at all. It just becomes Tuesday. Here is the part that will be uncomfortable to sit with. Denial doesn't feel like denial from inside it. It feels like being reasonable. It feels like being realistic about your responsibilities, practical about your obligations, mature about the trade-offs adult life requires. Every excuse you have ever made for staying somewhere that was quietly costing you something wore the mask of maturity. Nobody wakes up and decides, "Today I will refuse to see my own life clearly." Instead, 100 small, sensible-sounding reasons accumulate, each one plausible on its own, until together they form a wall thick enough to block the view entirely. Think about the last time you noticed something was wrong, and immediately reached for a reason it was fine. Your chest tightened during a conversation with someone you love, and you told yourself you were just tired. A decision felt wrong in your stomach before you made it, and you told yourself you were overthinking. These small overrides feel harmless individually. String enough of them together across years, and you have built a life you can no longer trust your own instincts about, because you have trained yourself, deliberately, to distrust the very signals that were trying to help you. There is a distinction worth making here, one that separates people who eventually change their lives from people who spend decades circling the same unexamined discomfort. It is the difference between not knowing and not looking. Not knowing is innocent. You cannot be blamed for a truth nobody showed you. Not looking is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one, even when it's dressed up as busyness or responsibility, or simply not having the time to think about it right now. The friend who says fine every single time is not confused about their job. They know. What they are doing is managing the distance between knowing and acting, and that distance is where most of a life quietly disappears. Thoreau went to the woods, in his own words, because he wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and to see if he could not learn what it had to teach. Read that phrase again slowly. Front the essential facts. Not avoid them, not manage them from a safe distance, not translate them into something more comfortable to hear. Face them directly, the way you face a person rather than a mirror image of a person, the way you face a bill rather than a folder where you put bills you haven't opened yet. You already have a folder like that somewhere. Maybe it's an actual folder. More likely it's internal, a place where you store the parts of your life you've decided not to look at closely. The relationship that isn't working the way you tell people it's working. The job that is costing you more of yourself than it pays you back. The habit you've explained away so many times, the explanation has started to sound true even to you. None of these things are hidden from you exactly. You know where the folder is. You have simply, functionally decided not to open it, and you have gotten remarkably good at believing that decision was never made at all. The pond that Thoreau built beside was famous for being clear enough to see straight to the bottom, even in deep water, at a time when most ponds nearby had gone murky with runoff and use. He wrote about that clarity like it mattered beyond the physical description, and it did. A clear pond lets you see exactly how deep you actually are. A murky one lets you guess, and guessing is always more comfortable, because you can guess in whatever direction keeps you moving forward without having to stop. There is a second, quieter version of functional denial worth naming, because it hides even better than the first. It is the denial that dresses itself up as self-knowledge. You have perhaps already told yourself a tidy story about why the discomfort exists. A story specific enough to sound like insight and vague enough to require nothing of you. It's just my personality. I've always been like this. That's just how the industry works. These explanations feel like clarity because they resolve the discomfort of not knowing. But an explanation that requires no action from you and conveniently absolves you of examining anything further is worth a second look. Real self-knowledge tends to cost something. Comfortable self-knowledge tends to be denial wearing insight's clothing. You don't have to open the folder tonight. Nobody is asking you to face everything at once, and anyone who tells you to is selling something. But you might, just once this week, notice the exact moment you say fine about something that isn't. Notice it without changing anything yet. Just notice it, the way you'd notice a sound in another room you've been trained not to hear anymore. That's where seeing begins, not with the answer, with admitting quietly that there was ever a question you'd stopped letting yourself ask. Chapter 3. The Pattern Named. Giving language to the thing you have felt for years but never once said out loud. There is a moment, somewhere in every honest conversation, where someone says a sentence that makes the room go quiet. Not because it's shocking, because it's accurate, in a way nobody had bothered to be before. You have felt this. Someone names a thing you've circled for years without ever landing on the word for it, and the relief is almost physical. A held breath finally let go. This chapter is that sentence. The pattern you've been living, the one behind the lost Sundays, and the automatic fine, and the folder you don't open, has a name, and the name is borrowed time. You have been spending your hours as though they belong to something other than you, an employer, an image, a version of adulthood assembled from other people's choices, and calling this arrangement normal because you never stop to ask who actually signed the lease on your own life. Thoreau named it more precisely than most people manage in a lifetime of trying. He wrote that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, and what is called resignation is confirmed desperation. Sit with the second half of that sentence, because it's the part everyone skips. Resignation. The thing you call being realistic. The thing you call growing up, settling down, accepting how things are. Thoreau is not describing people who never had ambition. He is describing people who had it once, and traded it for a manageable disappointment, and then spent years defending the trade as wisdom. You know this pattern from the inside, even if you've never called it by name. It shows up as the friend who used to talk about starting something, and now only talks about retirement math. It shows up in the way you've stopped finishing sentences that begin with someday. It shows up as a specific kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't touch, because it isn't a tiredness of the body. It's the tiredness of carrying a life you never fully agreed to. Here is the distinction that makes this pattern visible instead of just felt. There is a difference between limitation and resignation. Limitation is real. You do not have infinite money, infinite time, infinite chances to reverse a decision. Everyone lives inside limits, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of denial. Resignation is different. Resignation is mistaking a limit you were handed for a limit that is actually true, and then building an entire identity around never testing whether the second one holds. Limitation says, I cannot do everything. Resignation says, I have stopped checking what I can do. You have almost certainly resigned from something you never actually tested. A version of a career you decided was impossible because one person discouraged you once. A version of a relationship you assumed had to look a certain way because that's the only shape you'd seen modeled. A version of your own days you assumed had to be structured around other people's expectations, because you never tried arranging them any other way and watching what happened. Somewhere, a possibility got quietly filed under impossible, and you stopped noticing it was ever a decision instead of a fact. Consider a Wednesday, ordinary in every way. You catch your reflection in a window while walking to your car, and for half a second, you don't recognize the posture, the pace, the particular tightness around the shoulders. It isn't your face that startles you. It's the walk. It's the walk of someone who has somewhere to be and no interest in being there. You've had this half-second before. You've also, every single time, kept walking. Because stopping to examine it would mean admitting something you're not ready to hold in a parking lot on a Wednesday. This is the exact mechanism Thoreau spent 2 years trying to interrupt. He didn't go to the woods to escape work. He worked there too, planting beans, building his own shelter, keeping careful account of every expense down to the nail. What he escaped was the automatic quality of his previous life, the sense that the shape of his days had been decided by something outside himself before he'd ever had the chance to weigh in. He wanted, in his words, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, so that if it proved to be mean, he could get the whole genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world, and if it were sublime, he could know it by experience. Notice what he's actually asking for there. Not comfort, not certainty that the woods would fix him. He's asking for contact. Direct, unmanaged contact with his own actual life, instead of the filtered, softened, pre-approved version most people settle for, because direct contact is frightening. You have been avoiding that same contact, not out of cowardice, but because nobody ever showed you it was survivable. It is. People walk out the other side of an honest look at their own life every day. Most of them report the same thing. The looking was worse in imagination than in fact. Here is what naming the pattern actually gives you, and it is not a solution yet. This chapter will not hand you 5 steps to reclaim your time. What naming gives you is a boundary between the thing and yourself. As long as the disorder stays unnamed, it is indistinguishable from you. It feels like your personality, your circumstances, your fixed situation. The moment you name it, borrowed time, functional denial, resignation mistaken for wisdom, it becomes a thing you are in, rather than a thing you are. And anything you are in, you can eventually walk out of. There is one more layer to naming worth spelling out, because it explains why this step matters more than it seems to at first. A pattern without a name has no edges. It bleeds into everything, an unspecified heaviness attached to no particular cause, which makes it feel unsolvable because it feels like it is simply the texture of your life rather than one identifiable thread inside it. A named pattern has edges. It starts somewhere and ends somewhere, which means it can be examined, tested, and eventually changed. This is not a small linguistic trick. It is the actual mechanism by which vague suffering becomes a solvable problem. And it is why every chapter that follows depends on this one holding. You have already started walking. You noticed the cold coffee. You noticed the word fine sitting wrong in your mouth. You noticed the reflection in the window that didn't match the person you thought you were becoming. None of these noticings have changed anything yet, and that's fine, because noticing was never supposed to be the whole job. Noticing is just the door. What's on the other side of it is where this actually gets difficult, and where it actually gets real. For now, only this. The pattern has a name. Say it to yourself once honestly before you close this chapter. Not to fix it tonight. Just so it stops living in the part of you that has no words and starts living in the part of you that can finally begin to do something about it. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of the Mechanism. Taking the machine apart, gear by gear, without sentiment. Take apart a clock, and you find gears, not time. Time is what the gears produce when they're arranged correctly and left running. The pattern you named in the last chapter works the same way. Borrowed time, resignation, quiet desperation. These are not single events you can point to and blame. They are the output of a mechanism, several small parts working together, each one reasonable on its own, each one invisible, until you lay them side by side. Here is the first part. You wake up, and the day is already spoken for before you've had a single original thought about it. An alarm decides when your body stops resting. A commute decides how your morning gets spent. A schedule built by someone else, an employer, an algorithm, a set of expectations you never voted on, decides which hours are yours to fill and which are already filled. By the time you have a genuinely free choice about anything, you have often been awake for hours, and the muscle you'd use to make that choice hasn't been exercised since the last time you had the chance. Thoreau measured this mechanism the way an engineer measures a machine, part by part, without sentiment. He calculated exactly how many days of labor a man needed to earn a house, a farm, a life of respectable ownership. And he found the number staggering. Often a decade or more of a person's working years spent servicing a debt for shelter that could, in practice, be built with 2 years of deliberate effort. He was not arguing against houses. He was pointing at the mechanism that convinces a person the debt is unavoidable, when in fact it is one option among several, dressed up as the only option available. This is the second part of the mechanism, and it is quieter than the first. Once a person accepts the schedule, they need a reason the schedule is worth it. The mind supplies one automatically because a life spent on something meaningless is intolerable to actually sit inside. So the mechanism manufactures meaning after the fact. The job becomes your identity. The purchase becomes proof you're doing well. The busyness becomes evidence of importance. Because if you weren't important, why would you be this exhausted? None of these meanings were chosen first and then pursued. They were assigned retroactively to justify a structure that was already in motion before you had any say in it. You can watch this second part operate in real time if you pay attention to your own justifications. Notice the exact language you use to explain why you stay somewhere that drains you. It's stable. It's what's expected at this point. It would be irresponsible to walk away now. Every one of these phrases sounds like reasoning. Test them, and you'll often find they are not reasoning at all, but the mechanism defending its own continued operation, using the vocabulary of maturity to disguise the absence of an actual decision. Here is the distinction that separates people who eventually interrupt this mechanism from people who spend a lifetime inside it. It is the difference between a reason and a rationalization. A reason is something you arrive at by examining a situation honestly and weighing real costs against real benefits. A rationalization is something you arrive at backward, starting from a conclusion you've already committed to and working to justify it. Reasons can change your mind. Rationalizations exist specifically to prevent your mind from changing. The frightening part is that from inside your own head, the two feel identical. Both come dressed as clear thinking. Only one of them can survive being said out loud to someone who genuinely doesn't care whether you agree with them. Try this test on something you've been telling yourself for a while. Say the justification out loud to an imagined stranger who has no stake in your answer. Someone who isn't going to be impressed by your responsibility or reassured by your caution. Listen to how it sounds without the comfort of your own inner voice delivering it. Sometimes it holds up. Often, spoken plainly, it reveals itself as something closer to fear wearing a suit. The third part of the mechanism is the one that keeps the first two running without maintenance. It is distraction, and it is not accidental. A mind that has time to sit quietly with its own choices will eventually interrogate them. So the mechanism ensures that quiet time rarely arrives uninterrupted. Something is always available to fill it. A screen, a task, an obligation manufactured out of nothing more urgent than the discomfort of stillness. Thoreau built his cabin roughly a mile from the nearest neighbor, not for isolation as an end in itself, but because distance from constant company was the only way he'd found to hear his own thinking clearly enough to trust it. You do not need a cabin in the woods to interrupt this third part, though the instinct behind it is sound. What you need is smaller and more available than that, and also somehow harder. 10 unscheduled, unfilled minutes, sat through without reaching for anything to fill them. Try it once this week, and notice what comes up in the silence. Most people report the same experience. The first few minutes feel unbearable, itchy, almost physically uncomfortable. Then something shifts, and a thought arrives that had clearly been waiting a long time for the room to get quiet enough to be heard. It's worth being specific about why these three parts reinforce each other instead of simply coexisting. The unchosen schedule produces exhaustion, and exhaustion makes the manufactured meanings feel more necessary, because a person who believes their suffering is meaningful is more willing to tolerate it than a person who suspects it might be pointless. The manufactured meanings, in turn, make the distraction feel earned, a reward for a hard day rather than an avoidance of an honest one. And the distraction ensures there's never enough quiet left over to notice that the meanings were manufactured in the first place. Each part covers for the other two. That's what makes it a mechanism rather than three unrelated habits. Put the three parts together, and you have the full mechanism. A schedule you didn't choose, a set of meanings assigned backward to justify the schedule, and a constant stream of distraction that prevents you from examining either one closely enough to object. None of these parts is a villain. No one designed this mechanism to trap you specifically. It assembled itself out of 1,000 ordinary incentives: employers who benefit from your compliance, industries that profit from your distraction, a culture that rewards the appearance of busyness more than the substance of a considered life. The mechanism doesn't hate you. It simply doesn't require your consent to keep running, only your inattention. This is, in its own way, good news. A mechanism can be studied. A mechanism has parts, and parts can be examined one at a time without requiring you to overhaul your entire existence in a single afternoon. You do not have to dismantle the schedule, the meanings, and the distractions all at once. You only have to know now precisely what you're looking at when you notice the gears turning. That knowledge alone changes your position. You are no longer simply inside the machine. You are someone standing close enough to see how it works, which is the first requirement for ever deciding, on your own terms, whether to keep it running exactly as it is. Chapter 5. The Hidden Cost. The bill nobody sends you, quietly compounding in a currency you cannot replenish. Nobody sends you an invoice for the years you didn't spend the way you meant to. That's what makes this cost so easy to avoid calculating. A bad investment shows up on a statement. A wasted decade shows up nowhere. Not on paper, not in a notification, not anywhere you're forced to look at it. It simply arrives, one ordinary afternoon, as the quiet realization that you are further from where you meant to be than the number of years should have allowed. Thoreau did the math nobody wants to do. He calculated the cost of things not in currency, but in something more honest, the amount of life required to pay for them. A house was not worth its price tag. It was worth the exact number of days a person's one existence had to be surrendered to earn it. He wrote that the cost of a thing is the amount of life which is required to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run. Read that sentence as a formula rather than a quote. Whatever you're about to buy, whatever obligation you're about to accept, ask what it costs in the only currency that cannot be replenished. Not dollars. Hours you will never get back, spent becoming able to afford it. This calculation is uncomfortable because it applies to more than money. It applies to the relationship you've stayed in past the point of honesty, costing you a version of intimacy you'll never get to have with anyone else during those same years. It applies to the career you chose for its safety, costing you whatever you would have become if you'd chosen for its meaning instead. The hidden cost isn't always subtraction from a bank account. Sometimes it's subtraction from a life you'll only be able to see clearly in hindsight, when the bill finally comes due and there's no way left to negotiate the price. Here is what makes this cost so easy to postpone examining. It doesn't announce itself weekly. It compounds silently, the way interest does, invisible in any single month, and staggering across a decade. You don't notice the erosion between Tuesday and Wednesday. You notice it in the gap between who you assumed you'd be by now and who actually showed up to answer to that name. That gap has a cost, and the cost was paid in small, unnoticed installments, none of which felt significant enough to interrupt at the time they were being spent. Consider the specific shape this takes for someone in their 30s or 40s, looking at a life assembled mostly out of defaults. The job taken because it was offered, not chosen because it was wanted. The house purchased because that's what people do at this stage, not because it matched any actual vision of a life worth building. Each individual default was reasonable in the moment it was made. Stacked together across 15 years, they produce something closer to a stranger's life, technically yours, unmistakably not the one you meant to build. There is a distinction worth naming here, because it protects you from despair while still forcing honesty. It is the difference between a sunk cost and a continuing one. A sunk cost is spent, unrecoverable, and grieving it further only adds a second cost on top of the first. A continuing cost is different. It is the price you are still paying today for a decision made years ago that you have never revisited. Sunk costs deserve acknowledgement and then release. Continuing costs deserve action, because every day you leave them running, the total keeps climbing. Most people confuse the two, and the confusion is where a life gets stuck. They treat a continuing cost as though it were already sunk, unchangeable, water long gone under a bridge, when in fact the water is still flowing and still available to redirect. The job that no longer fits is not a sunk cost. It's a continuing one, renewing itself every single day you stay without reconsidering. The relationship maintained out of habit rather than choice is not water under the bridge. It's water still running, still costing you. Every week you don't have the conversation that would either fix it or end it honestly. Thoreau's arithmetic wasn't cruelty toward the men he watched laboring under mortgages and inherited farms. It was clarity offered as a kind of mercy. He wanted them to see the actual exchange rate they were living under, not to shame them, but because a person who sees the true cost of something can finally make a real decision about whether to keep paying it. Most men, he observed, labor under a mistake, laying up treasures which moth and rust will corrupt, without ever calculating what those treasures actually cost them, in the one resource that cannot be replaced once spent. There is one more distortion worth naming, because it makes the hidden cost even easier to ignore than it would otherwise be. Costs paid in time feel abstract, in a way costs paid in money never do. A missing sum in a bank account produces an immediate, visceral response. A missing decade produces nothing you can point to directly, because there is no ledger anywhere showing you the life you didn't live alongside the one you did. The absence of a felt reminder is not the absence of a real cost. It only means the cost is easier to underprice, right up until the day the comparison becomes impossible to avoid, usually far later than anyone would have chosen to first notice it. You are allowed to run this calculation on your own life, without it becoming a verdict against everything you've built. Some of what you've paid for was worth every hour it cost. That's not the part this chapter is asking you to examine. The part worth examining is the cost you've been paying without ever consciously agreeing to the price, the continuing costs disguised as settled facts, the installments so small individually that you never noticed you were still making payments on a decision you don't even remember choosing. Here is where this leaves you, and it is not a comfortable place, though it is an honest one. Somewhere in your life right now, a cost is compounding quietly, unexamined, mistaken for something fixed and unchangeable, when it is, in fact, still very much a continuing bill. You don't have to identify it tonight, but you should know clearly that it exists, and that every day it goes unexamined is another small installment paid toward a total you have not yet allowed yourself to add up. The reckoning doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives exactly like this, one honest calculation at a time until the total becomes too large to keep avoiding. There is a final piece of this arithmetic worth carrying forward because it changes how the rest of this narrative should be read. A hidden cost, once actually seen, does not automatically demand a dramatic response. It only demands an honest one. You do not have to quit the job tomorrow or end the relationship tonight, simply because you finally calculated what it's costing you. What you owe yourself is smaller and more immediate than that. You owe yourself the accounting itself, done honestly, without flinching away from the total the moment it starts to look larger than you'd like. Everything that follows in this narrative depends on that accounting having actually happened. Chapter 6. Why the Previous Attempts Failed. Reading old failures as data instead of a verdict against your character. You have tried before, maybe not with this exact language, this exact framing, but you have stood at this edge before, felt the pull toward a more deliberate life, and made some version of an attempt to reach it. A New Year's resolution that lasted 3 weeks. A weekend where you swore off your phone and made it to Sunday evening before reaching for it out of pure reflex. A conversation you finally had, followed by the same old pattern returning within a month, as though the conversation had never happened at all. If you're honest, there's a small graveyard of these attempts behind you, and their failure has probably taught you the wrong lesson. It has taught you that you're the kind of person who doesn't follow through, when the truer explanation is simpler and far less damning. The attempts were built wrong from the start. Here is the first reason they failed, and it's the most common one by far. You tried to change the output without touching the mechanism. You deleted the app, but kept the same unstructured evenings that made the app necessary in the first place. So within days, something else filled the exact shape the app used to fill. You quit the job but carried the same relationship to worth and productivity into the next one. So the new job eventually produced the identical exhaustion, just with a different logo on the badge. Willpower aimed at a symptom will always eventually lose to a mechanism still fully intact underneath it. This isn't a character flaw. It's basic engineering. You cannot dismantle a machine by refusing to look at one gear while the rest keep turning. Thoreau understood this distinction with unusual precision for a man who is often remembered only for the pond and the cabin. He did not simply remove himself from society and call the removal itself the solution. He rebuilt, from the ground up, his actual relationship to necessity, tracking every expense, questioning every assumed need, testing directly whether the comforts he'd taken for granted were requirements or habits mistaken for requirements. He wrote that he went to the woods to live deliberately, and deliberately is doing enormous work in that sentence. Not accidentally, not by removing one bad habit and hoping the rest sorted itself out. By deliberate reconstruction, piece by piece, of what his actual life required. Here is the second reason your previous attempts failed. And this one is harder to hear because it implicates people you love. You tried to change alone, inside a system of relationships that had quietly organized itself around your old patterns. Your friends expect you to be reachable at all hours, because you always have been. Your family expects your evenings and weekends to be available, because they always were. You didn't just build a habit. You built an ecosystem of other people's expectations around that habit. And when you tried to change only your own behavior while leaving their expectations completely undisturbed, you were fighting a battle on one front while an entire supply line kept feeding the old pattern from the other side. This is not an argument for isolating yourself the way people sometimes misread Thoreau as having done. He had visitors. He walked into town regularly. What he changed was not his relationships, but his terms within them, the specific expectations he was willing to meet automatically, versus the ones he now required a real reason to meet. Most failed attempts at change never touch this layer at all. They ask the individual to become stronger, while the surrounding system remains exactly as demanding as it was before, guaranteeing that the individual, however motivated, is eventually worn back down to the old shape by sheer relentless pressure from everyone still expecting the old version of them to show up. There is a third reason, quieter than the first two, and in some ways more decisive. You tried to change everything at once. The New Year's resolution wasn't just about the phone. It was about the phone, the diet, the exercise, the sleep schedule, the finances, all launched on the same January morning with the same finite reserve of motivation, expected to fund all five simultaneously. Motivation is not an unlimited resource. It behaves more like a battery than a bottomless well, and five demanding changes launched together will drain that battery within days, at which point the mind, exhausted and demoralized, concludes that change itself doesn't work when the actual lesson was narrower and less damning. 5 at once doesn't work. That's a logistics problem, not a character verdict. Here is a distinction that matters enormously and gets collapsed constantly. There is a difference between failure and information. A failed attempt that teaches you nothing about why it failed really is just a failure, one more entry in the graveyard. But a failed attempt examined honestly, with real curiosity about which of these three reasons undid it, stops being simple failure and becomes something closer to data. You now know, with real specificity, that symptom-only changes don't survive contact with an untouched mechanism. You know that changes attempted in isolation from the relationships around you get quietly undermined by expectations nobody ever renegotiated. You know that 5 changes launched together will outpace whatever motivation is funding them. This is not nothing. This is exactly the information required to build an attempt that might actually hold. There is a fourth reason worth adding, smaller than the first 3 but easy to overlook. Many past attempts failed simply because they had no way to notice their own failure until it was already complete. Nothing was tracked. Nothing was checked in on. No specific moment existed where the attempt could have been caught slipping and corrected before it fully unraveled. A plan with no checkpoints doesn't fail loudly. It fails silently, one skipped day blending into the next, until an entire month has passed without anyone, including you, noticing the thread had already been dropped weeks earlier. You are not starting from zero, no matter how many times it's felt that way. Every attempt that didn't stick still mapped part of the terrain. It showed you where the mechanism actually lives, which relationships actually need renegotiating, how much change your motivation can genuinely fund at once before it collapses under its own weight. The failures were not proof you can't do this. They were the reconnaissance required to finally do it correctly. There is one more thing worth saying about the graveyard of past attempts, because it changes how you relate to it going forward. A graveyard implies something buried and finished, but these attempts were never actually failures in the complete sense the word suggests. Each one moved something, even if the movement wasn't visible at the time. A resolution that lasted 3 weeks still proved you could sustain a change for 3 weeks, which is not nothing, and is in fact a longer stretch than many people manage on their very first try at anything. The problem was never that nothing happened during those 3 weeks. The problem was that nothing was built to catch you once the initial motivation ran out, which is a completely different and far more solvable problem than the one you'd been blaming yourself for. What comes next in this narrative is not another resolution launched with more willpower than the last one. It is something built with the specific lessons of your own past attempts already accounted for, aimed directly at the mechanism instead of its symptoms, built with the people around you factored in rather than ignored, and small enough at the start to survive the first difficult week without draining a reserve that was never going to be large enough to fund everything at once. This time, you're not starting over. You're starting informed. Chapter 7. The First Real Move. Small enough to survive a bad week. Real enough to finally begin. There is a version of this moment you've imagined before, probably many times. The dramatic one. The day you finally quit, finally leave, finally burn it all down and walk out into a completely different life. Transformed in a single decisive act that makes for a good story later. That moment rarely comes, and waiting for it is itself a form of the mechanism protecting itself. Because a change that large feels so far away it never has to be started today. The real first move looks almost nothing like the fantasy. It is small enough to be unimpressive, and that is exactly why it works. Thoreau's actual first move was not building the cabin. It was smaller than that, and stranger. Before he ever picked up an axe, he spent time simply walking the woods around Walden Pond, getting to know the actual land, the actual seasons, the actual rhythm of a place he had, until then, only passed through on his way somewhere else. He was, in effect, paying attention before he was doing anything. Most people skip this step entirely. They want the axe, the cabin, the dramatic before and after. They want to already be the person who lives deliberately, without ever practicing the much smaller, much less photogenic skill of simply noticing their own actual days. So here is the real first move, and it will disappoint the part of you that wanted something grander. Pick one single evening this week, and before you fill it with anything, ask what you would do if nobody was watching, and nothing needed to be proven. Not a productive evening, not a self-improvement evening, an honest one. Then do that thing, whatever it turns out to be, even if it looks unremarkable from the outside. Even if it's just sitting on your porch until the light changes color, watching it happen instead of documenting it happening. This will feel absurdly small, and the smallness is not a flaw in the plan. It is the entire design. Chapter 6 already showed you why large dramatic attempts fail. They outpace the motivation available to fund them and collapse under their own weight within days. A move this small requires almost no motivation at all, which means it can survive the exact conditions that killed every previous resolution. A bad day, a tired week, a schedule that gets disrupted by something unexpected. The first real move has to be sized for your worst week, not your best one, because your best week was never actually the problem. There is a distinction worth making here between momentum and intensity. Intensity is a burst, dramatic and unsustainable. The January gym membership used 4 times before December arrives again. Momentum is different. Momentum is small and consistent, barely noticeable in any single instance, and yet it is the only one of the two that actually survives long enough to compound into something real. You have spent years mistaking intensity for progress, launching hard and burning out fast, and calling the burnout proof that change doesn't work for you. It wasn't proof of that. It was proof that intensity, by its nature, is not built to last, no matter who is attempting it. Notice what happens in your body the moment you consider actually doing this. Picking one evening and protecting it. Doing only what feels honest rather than productive. Some resistance will surface almost immediately, and it deserves attention rather than dismissal. Part of it will sound like practicality. You don't have time this week. Better to start next week when things calm down. Weeks that calm down on their own are rare enough to be nearly mythical. If you wait for that week, you will wait considerably longer than you think. Because the calm week was never actually coming. It gets manufactured on purpose, inside a week that doesn't look calm at all. Another part of the resistance will sound more honest. and it deserves more respect. It will feel like fear, oddly disproportionate to something as small as an unscheduled evening. This fear is worth sitting with rather than pushing past too quickly, because it's telling you something true. An empty evening, genuinely empty, undirected by any task or obligation, forces you into direct contact with your own mind in a way your schedule has been quietly protecting you from for years. The busyness was never just busyness. Some of it was insulation. Removing even one evening's worth of that insulation will let something through that hasn't had room to surface in a long time, and that something might not be entirely comfortable. This is fine. This is, in fact, the entire point. You are not trying to have a pleasant evening. You are trying to have an honest one, and honest is not always the same as pleasant, at least not at first. Thoreau wrote about wanting to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, and marrow is not a soft word. It requires breaking something open to get at it. The first real move breaks nothing as dramatic as bone, but it does crack the shell of automatic scheduling just enough to let you see what's actually underneath it, possibly for the first time in longer than you'd like to admit. It's worth saying plainly what this first evening is not. It is not a test you can pass or fail. There is no version of it where you sit down expecting insight and instead feel bored, restless, or oddly flat, and that counts as having done it wrong. Boredom, restlessness, and flatness are simply what unstructured time feels like to a mind that has not been allowed to experience it in years. They are not signs the exercise failed. They are the exact sensation of the insulation being removed, uncomfortable precisely because it is doing exactly what it was meant to do. There's a practical reason this specific size matters more than any other. An evening is long enough to actually produce something worth noticing. A thought, a feeling, a piece of clarity that wouldn't have surfaced in 10 rushed minutes. But it's short enough that missing one, on a week that genuinely doesn't allow it, doesn't threaten the whole structure. A single evening is small enough to fail without consequence, and large enough to matter when it succeeds, which is exactly the balance every previous larger attempt was missing. One more thing worth knowing before you try this. The first evening is almost never the best one. People often report that the second or third attempt feels more natural than the first, simply because the first is spent partly negotiating with the discomfort itself, and only the later attempts get to actually use the space for anything beyond that negotiation. If the first evening feels strange, awkward, or underwhelming, that is not evidence to abandon the practice. It is closer to the ordinary cost of doing anything unfamiliar for the first time, a cost that predictably drops with repetition rather than staying fixed. Try the evening, not next month, not once your schedule settles this week. Notice what you actually want to do once nothing is telling you what to do. Notice what surfaces when the noise finally has somewhere to go besides straight back into more noise. You don't have to act on any of it yet. You only have to let it exist undisturbed for one evening, which will already be more honesty than most weeks of your life have contained in a very long time. That's the whole move. Small enough to survive a bad week, real enough to finally begin. Chapter 8. The Internal Resistance. The mind's oldest, loudest argument for staying exactly where it already is. Something pushed back the moment you tried the evening from the last chapter. Maybe you noticed it directly. A restlessness that had you reaching for your phone within 20 minutes, despite every intention not to. Maybe it was quieter than that. A nagging sense that you should be doing something more useful with the time, followed by a small avalanche of tasks that suddenly felt urgent the moment you sat still long enough to hear them. Either way, something in you resisted the very thing you decided you wanted. This is not a sign you failed. This is the part of the process nobody warns you about clearly enough. And it deserves its own chapter because skipping past it is exactly how the previous attempts quietly died. Call this resistance what it actually is, not weakness, not a lack of discipline, but a genuine internal defense system doing precisely what it was built to do. The mind does not distinguish cleanly between danger and unfamiliarity. A nervous system that has spent years organized around busyness, distraction, and constant low-grade stimulation experiences the sudden absence of those things as a kind of threat, not because stillness is actually dangerous, but because the system has no recent record of stillness being safe. It reacts the way any protective system reacts to something outside its known range, with alarm first and evaluation later. Thoreau met a version of this resistance directly, and he didn't pretend it wasn't real. He wrote candidly about restlessness in his early weeks at the pond, admitting that even surrounded by exactly the deliberate life he'd chosen, some part of him kept reaching backward toward the noise and habit of the town he'd left. He didn't treat this reaching as proof the experiment had failed. He treated it as data, evidence of how deeply the old pattern had rooted itself, and therefore how much patience the new pattern would require before it could compete with a groove that deep. Here is the distinction that will save you from misreading this resistance entirely. There is a difference between resistance and a wrong decision. A wrong decision produces a settled, clear sense that something is off, a feeling that tends to deepen and clarify the longer you sit with it. Resistance produces the opposite. It's loud in the first few minutes and often fades if you simply stay put without acting on it. If you notice restlessness at the start of the quiet evening, and it's still exactly as intense 40 minutes later, that might be real information worth listening to. But if it spikes hard in the first 10 minutes and then, almost against your will, starts to loosen, that's not your intuition warning you off course. That's the old mechanism throwing its last, loudest arguments before losing its grip. You will feel this internal resistance most sharply in the exact moments that matter most, which is not a coincidence. It shows up strongest right before the unscheduled evening, right before the honest conversation you've been avoiding, right before the boundary you've never quite had the nerve to state out loud. This is not evidence that you're approaching the wrong thing. It's closer to a landmark, a signal that you're standing directly at the edge of the old pattern's territory, which is exactly where its defenses are thickest. Notice, too, the specific shape the resistance tends to take, because recognizing its costume in advance robs it of some of its power. It rarely announces itself as fear, which would be too easy to catch. It shows up instead as sudden practicality, a genuinely urgent feeling task that appears exactly when the quiet evening was supposed to begin. It shows up as fatigue that arrives right on schedule, heavier than the fatigue of any other evening that week. It shows up as a flood of reasons why tonight isn't actually the right night, reasons that sound completely reasonable and somehow only ever occur to you at the exact moment stillness was about to begin. There is a second layer to this resistance worth naming honestly, because it involves people you care about, and it will otherwise blindside you. When you start changing the shape of your evenings, your availability, your automatic yes to every request, some of the people around you will resist the change too, not out of malice, but because your old pattern was convenient for them in ways neither of you had ever examined out loud. A friend who's used to reaching you anytime will feel the shift when you're suddenly less reachable, and their discomfort may come back at you sounding like concern, or hurt, or even accusation. This isn't proof you're doing something wrong. It's proof the ecosystem Chapter 6 described is real, and it's recalibrating around a version of you it hasn't met yet. Here is what actually works against this resistance, and it isn't force. Force tends to produce exactly the collapse Chapter 6 already described, a hard push followed by an even harder snap back. What works instead is something closer to patience, paired with repetition. The same small, honest evening, or its equivalent, returned to again and again, not because the first attempt felt good, but because the 10th attempt at something will always feel different from the first. The nervous system doesn't update its sense of safety through a single data point. It updates through pattern, through the accumulated evidence of doing the uncomfortable thing repeatedly and surviving it every single time. You are not trying to eliminate the resistance before you start. That's backward, and it's a trap many people fall into, waiting to feel ready before they begin, when readiness was never going to arrive first. Readiness is what gets built by going through the resistance, not what precedes it. The discomfort of the quiet evening is not a sign to wait for a better week. It is itself the exact material the change is being built out of. The same way muscle is built not in the absence of resistance, but specifically because of it. There is a final piece worth naming, because it will keep you from mistaking a good sign for a bad one later. As the pattern strengthens over the following weeks, the resistance does not vanish all at once. It thins gradually, and it often resurfaces briefly at moments of stress, fatigue, or disruption, not because the progress was undone, but because resistance has a long memory and a short attention span. A flare-up after weeks of relative ease is not evidence you're back at the beginning. It's evidence the old groove is still there, fainter now, occasionally still catching a wheel that has mostly learned a new path. Sit with this the next time the restlessness rises. Don't fight it, and don't obey it either. Just notice it, the way you'd notice weather passing through, real, sometimes uncomfortable, but never actually as permanent as it insists on feeling in its first 10 minutes. On the other side of it, almost always, is something quieter waiting to be heard, something that has been trying to get your attention for longer than you've been willing to admit. Chapter 9. Applying under low energy. What the pattern is actually made of. Not your best days, but your worst ones. Everything works when you're rested, motivated, and the week is going well. That's not a real test of anything. The real test arrives on the evening you're exhausted, the day everything went wrong before 9 in the morning, the week your energy is already spent on things you didn't choose and had no way to avoid. This is where most of the progress from the last few chapters quietly disappears, not because the ideas stopped being true, but because nobody prepared for the version of you that shows up when there's nothing left in reserve. You already know this pattern from experience, even if you've never named it precisely. On a good day, the deliberate evening feels almost natural, even enjoyable. On a depleted day, the old pattern doesn't just tempt you back. It feels like the only physically possible option, as though choosing anything else would require a strength you simply don't have available. This isn't an illusion exactly. Willpower does behave like a finite resource, and a day that has already drained most of it leaves very little in the tank for anything that requires deliberate effort, including the effort of living deliberately. Thoreau never pretended his experiment ran on inspiration alone. He wrote about the ordinary discomforts of his life at the pond in plain, unglamorous terms: cold mornings, imperfect harvests, the sheer physical labor required to sustain something as simple as staying warm through a New England winter. The deliberate life he was building didn't run on his best days any more than it ran on his worst. It ran on structure sturdy enough to hold regardless of which kind of day showed up, because he understood something most people learn the hard way. A system that only works when you feel like using it isn't actually a system. It's a mood, dressed up as a plan. Here is the distinction that matters most in this chapter, and it will change how you think about every low-energy day going forward. There is a difference between the full version of a practice and the floor version of it. The full version is what you do on a good day, the entire unscheduled evening, the complete boundary held without wavering, the whole conversation had with total clarity. The floor version is the smallest possible unit of the same practice, small enough to survive a day when you have almost nothing left. Most people only ever build the full version, and when a depleted day arrives, they face an impossible choice between doing the whole thing or doing nothing, and depleted people reliably choose nothing. Build the floor version before you need it, not during the moment you discover you need it. Because building anything requires exactly the resource you won't have available in that moment. if the full version of your unscheduled evening is 2 hours of undirected time. The floor version might be 10 minutes sat through without a screen, on the worst night of your week. If the full version of a boundary is a complete calm conversation, the floor version might be a single sentence, said imperfectly, that at least keeps the pattern from fully collapsing back to where it started. The floor version will never look impressive. It isn't supposed to. Its entire purpose is to exist on the days the impressive version simply isn't available, so that the pattern survives the gap instead of dying in it. Notice what happens on a genuinely bad day when the old pattern comes back for you, because it will. And understanding its argument in advance takes away most of its power. It won't argue loudly against your goals. It will argue quietly for exceptions. Just this once. You've had a hard enough day already. You can start again tomorrow when things are calmer. Every one of these arguments sounds reasonable in isolation, and every one of them, said enough times across enough hard days, adds up to no actual change at all, because there is always another hard day arriving right behind the one currently making its case for an exception. This is where the floor version earns its value. It doesn't ask you to override the exhaustion, which rarely works and often backfires into resentment toward the entire project. It asks you to do the smallest true version of the thing anyway, not because it will feel meaningful in the moment, it usually won't, but because consistency, even minimal consistency, is what separates a practice from a phase. The 10 minutes without a screen on your worst night matters less for what happens in those 10 minutes and more for what it proves to the part of you keeping score. It proves the pattern held. It proves you are someone who continues even when it isn't easy, which is a completely different claim than being someone who only continues when it is. There is a kind of mercy hidden inside the floor version that's worth naming directly. It removes the all-or-nothing trap that has quietly sabotaged most of your previous attempts at change. You don't have to choose between the full, deliberate evening and total collapse back into old habits. You have a third option, small, unglamorous, and available on even your worst day, and having that third option available changes the entire emotional weight of a hard day. It stops being a threat to the progress you've made and starts being simply another day the floor version got done. No different in kind from any other day, just smaller in scale. It helps to actually decide, in advance and in writing if possible, what your specific floor version looks like, rather than trying to improvise one in the exact moment you're too depleted to think clearly. A floor version decided ahead of time, when you have the clarity to design it well, requires no thinking at all to execute later. A floor version invented on the spot during exhaustion is exactly the kind of decision exhaustion is worst at making, which is why it so often collapses into simply skipping the day entirely. There is a further benefit to the floor version that only becomes visible over time. Because it asks so little, it is one of the only versions of the practice you can sustain literally every single day, without exception, which means it becomes the most reliable evidence generator of the entire system. A full evening protected twice a week produces real progress, but leaves 5 days of silence in between. 5 days where the old identity has room to reassert its version of events. A floor version deployed daily, even on the good days when the full version would have been just as available, closes that gap entirely, and gives the part of your mind still keeping score a continuous record instead of an intermittent one. You will have more low-energy days than high-energy ones over the course of a real life. This isn't pessimism. It's just the honest ratio most people live inside once youth and its surplus of energy have passed. A deliberate life built only for the good days was never going to survive contact with an actual life. Build the floor now while you have the energy to design it carefully. Then trust it completely on the day you have nothing else left to give. Because that day is coming, and how the pattern holds up on that specific day will determine far more about your next 10 years than anything you do on a good one. Chapter 10. The Relational Dimension. Nobody builds a deliberate life alone. and pretending otherwise is its own kind of avoidance. You have not been building this alone, even though most of the last 9 chapters focused on the space inside your own head. Every evening you protect, every boundary you hold, every hour reclaimed from the old pattern touches at least one other person who had, until now, some claim on that time. This chapter faces that directly, because a deliberate life built in total isolation from the people around you isn't actually deliberate. It's just avoidance wearing a nicer word. Thoreau is remembered wrongly as a man who fled human company entirely. The record tells a different story. He walked into town regularly during his 2 years at the pond, kept up correspondence, welcomed visitors to his cabin, and once noted that he had more visitors at Walden than he'd had in the busier stretches of his previous life, because the visitors who came deliberately, and stayed for real conversation rather than passing time. What he removed wasn't people. It was the automatic, unexamined obligation to be endlessly available to anyone who wanted him, regardless of what that availability was costing him. This is the distinction the relational dimension turns on, and it's easy to get backward. There is a difference between connection and availability. Connection is chosen, mutual, and tends to leave you fuller than it found you. Availability is often assumed, one-directional, and tends to leave you slightly emptier each time, in ways too small to notice individually and too consistent to ignore across a year. Most people, without ever deciding to, have let availability stand in for connection so completely that reducing the first feels, wrongly, like a betrayal of the second. Here is where this becomes uncomfortable rather than theoretical. The people most affected by your new boundaries are rarely strangers. They are the people closest to you, the ones who built their own expectations around the old version of your time. A partner used to your evenings being flexible around their needs will notice immediately when an evening becomes protected instead. A parent used to a certain frequency of calls will feel the change in frequency before you've even finished explaining the reason for it. This is not evidence you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you were, until recently, a fixed and reliable variable in other people's equations, and any change to a fixed variable ripples through everything calculated around it. Some of that rippling will look like discomfort dressed up as concern. You seem different lately. Is everything okay? Why are you suddenly so busy? These questions can be genuine, and they deserve honest answers. They can also sometimes be the ecosystem's way of trying to restore its previous, more convenient configuration, without either party fully realizing that's what's happening. The distinction matters enormously, because responding to a genuine question with defensiveness damages a relationship that deserved better, and responding to a subtle pressure campaign with total capitulation undoes every ounce of the work from the last 9 chapters. Learn to tell the two apart by paying attention to what happens after you answer honestly. Genuine concern tends to soften once it receives a real explanation, even if the explanation isn't what the other person hoped to hear. It might still involve disappointment, but the disappointment coexists with respect for your reasoning. Pressure disguised as concern tends to do the opposite. It resists the explanation, circles back to the same complaint in a different form, treats your reasoning as an obstacle to argue past, rather than information to actually take in. You are allowed to notice this difference and respond accordingly, holding steady with the people who eventually come to respect the change, and having a harder, more honest conversation with the people who won't. There is a second layer to the relational dimension, quieter than the first, and easy to miss entirely. Some of the people around you are not resisting your change. They are watching it closely, often without saying so, because your willingness to reclaim your own time is making them look directly at how little of their own time they've reclaimed. This can produce 2 very different reactions, and you rarely know in advance which one you'll get. Some people, watching you, find permission they didn't know they were waiting for, and begin, tentatively, making similar changes in their own lives. Others find the comparison unbearable, and the discomfort they can't name toward their own unexamined life gets redirected at you instead, disguised as criticism of your choices rather than acknowledged as discomfort about their own. Neither reaction is something you're responsible for managing. You didn't cause the first person's inspiration, and you don't owe the second person an apology for triggering a discomfort that was always theirs to eventually face. What you owe both of them and yourself is consistency, the same deliberate evening protected regardless of which reaction shows up in response to it. Because bending the boundary based on someone else's discomfort simply transfers the cost of your deliberate life back onto you, the exact arrangement this entire narrative has been trying to help you exit. It's worth adding one more distinction here, because it will come up the moment you start holding any boundary at all. There is a difference between a boundary and a wall. A boundary says, "Here is what I am and am not available for," and remains open to real connection within those terms. A wall says nothing is available, and mistakes distance itself for safety. Thoreau built the first kind, not the second. He wanted contact, real and chosen, not the absence of people. If your new evenings start to feel like a wall rather than a boundary, if the relief of protecting your time slowly curdles into a preference for no one's company at all, that's worth noticing too, because isolation dressed up as deliberateness is simply the old mechanism wearing a new disguise. There is also a specific practical way to renegotiate an old expectation without making it feel like a rejection of the person holding it. State the new boundary in terms of what you're moving toward, not only what you're moving away from. I'm protecting my evenings, so I actually have something left to bring to our conversations. Lands very differently than I can't talk in the evenings anymore, even though the practical change is identical. The first version invites the other person into the reason. The second simply announces the restriction and leaves them to invent their own explanation for it, which is rarely the generous one. Thoreau's version of this in the end wasn't isolation. It was selectivity, exercised honestly, without apology and without cruelty. He kept the relationships that could hold real conversation and real presence, and he let go of the constant low-grade social obligation that had never actually been connection to begin with, just habit mistaken for closeness. You are not being asked to withdraw from the people who matter to you. You are being asked to finally notice which relationships were built on genuine mutual presence, and which ones were simply built on your reliable, unexamined availability. Because only one of those two is actually worth protecting as you build the rest of this. Chapter 11. The Oldest Root. Where the pattern actually came from, and why it survived so long unquestioned. Every pattern this narrative has named so far, the borrowed time, the functional denial, the mechanism, the hidden cost, has a point of origin. None of these patterns arrived in you at 25 or 30, fully formed, ready to run your life. They were installed earlier, quietly, usually before you had any language to evaluate what was being handed to you, which is exactly why they've felt less like choices and more like facts about who you are. This chapter goes looking for the root, not to assign blame, but because a pattern whose origin you understand loses a significant portion of its grip. Consider where you first learned that busyness was virtuous. Almost nobody arrives at that belief on their own through independent reasoning conducted in a vacuum. It was modeled usually by the adults closest to you during the years you were still deciding what a normal, respectable life looked like. Maybe it was a parent who equated rest with laziness, who wore exhaustion like a badge and treated stillness as something to apologize for. Maybe it was a wider culture, absorbed slowly through 1,000 small signals, that rewarded visible strain and quietly punished anyone who seemed to be managing their life without enough struggle attached to it. You didn't choose this belief. You inherited it, the way you inherited a native language, so early and so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like a belief at all and started feeling like reality. Thoreau traced a version of this same inheritance in the farmers around Walden Pond, men who had received their debts along with their land, from fathers who had received the same arrangement from fathers before them. He observed that they had no time to be anything but a machine, inheriting farms, houses, cattle, and farming tools, for these are more easily acquired than got rid of. Notice the phrase more easily acquired than got rid of. He wasn't only describing property. He was describing an entire relationship to work and worth, handed down the way property is handed down, accepted by each generation, largely because refusing it would have meant refusing something that looked, from the inside, exactly like love. This is the distinction that makes the oldest root difficult to face honestly. There is a difference between inheritance and identity. Inheritance is something given to you, often by people who loved you and were themselves only passing along what they'd been given. Identity is something you build, ideally with some awareness of which parts came from inheritance and which parts you actually examined and chose. Most people never separate the two. They live out an inherited pattern as though it were an identity they arrived at independently, and any suggestion that the pattern might not be theirs to keep feels, disorientingly, like an attack on who they fundamentally are. You can find your own version of this root by asking a specific uncomfortable question. Whose voice do you hear when you imagine resting without earning it first? For most people, it isn't a stranger's voice, and it isn't fully their own either. It's some blend of the adults who first taught them what a day was supposed to look like, echoing forward, decades later, through a mind that has mostly forgotten where the voice originally came from. That voice feels like conscience. Often it's closer to inheritance, running on autopilot, never actually re-examined since the year it first got installed. Here is what makes this root so durable compared to every pattern discussed so far in this narrative. The other patterns, the mechanism, the resistance, the low-energy collapse, are mostly maintained by present-day incentives, a job that rewards compliance, a culture that rewards distraction. The oldest root is maintained by something harder to argue with, love, or the memory of it. Examining the belief that busyness proves worth means, indirectly, examining the person who first taught you that belief. And most people would rather carry an exhausting pattern for another 20 years than risk what feels like a betrayal of someone who meant well and simply passed along what they themselves had never gotten the chance to question. This is where the distinction between inheritance and identity becomes genuinely useful rather than just theoretical. You can release a pattern without condemning the person who handed it to you. You do not have to conclude that a parent who modeled constant strain was wrong to love you the way they did, or that their intentions were anything other than sincere. You only have to conclude that what they gave you, sincerely and with love, does not have to be the final shape of your own one life. A gift can be received with gratitude, and still, eventually, be set down, especially when carrying it has started costing you more than either of you ever intended. There is a practical test worth applying here, gentler than it might sound. Picture the person whose voice you hear when you imagine resting without earning it first, and imagine telling them honestly what carrying their inheritance has actually cost you. Most people, doing this exercise sincerely, find that the imagined person softens rather than hardens, because the inheritance was rarely meant as a life sentence. It was simply the only model available to someone doing their best with what they'd been given themselves. Seeing that clearly is often what finally makes it possible to set the pattern down without guilt attached to the setting down. It's worth noting, too, that not every root traces back to a person at all. Sometimes the inheritance came from an era rather than an individual, a decade that rewarded a particular kind of striving, a specific economic anxiety that shaped an entire generation's relationship to security and work. In those cases, there's no single person to picture and forgive, only a set of circumstances that made a certain exhausting posture feel like the only sane response available at the time. The same principle still applies. You can recognize the circumstances that produced the pattern without being obligated to keep living inside a response built for conditions that, in many cases, no longer exist for you the way they did for whoever first adopted it. Thoreau didn't hate the farmers he described. He wrote about them with something closer to grief, watching men labor under a load they had never actually chosen, inherited so early and so completely that choosing had stopped feeling like an available option at all. His entire project at the pond was, in part, an argument that the load could be set down, examined, and picked back up only if it turned out to actually be necessary, rather than carried forward automatically simply because it had always been carried. You are not required to solve your entire inheritance in one sitting. You are only required for now to notice that a root exists, running underneath every pattern this narrative has named so far, and that the root is older than any job you've held or any habit you've built as an adult. Naming it doesn't sever it immediately, but it does something almost as important. It turns an invisible inheritance into a visible choice, available, for the first time, to actually be examined rather than simply carried forward on the strength of how long it's been there. Chapter 12. Why Progress Disappears. The exact unglamorous mechanics of how gains erode and what actually holds them in place. You have had this experience before, and it deserves its own chapter because it's the exact moment most people quietly give up. Weeks of real progress, evenings genuinely reclaimed, a boundary actually held, and then, without any dramatic cause you can point to, it's gone. Not all at once. It erodes, the way a shoreline erodes, no single wave responsible, and yet the shape of the coast is undeniably different by the time you notice. You look up one day and realize you're back on your phone every evening, back to the old fine, back inside the mechanism you thought you'd finally started dismantling. This chapter is about why that happens, and more importantly, about what actually protects progress once it exists. Progress disappears for a reason most people never identify correctly. They assume the change failed because their commitment weakened, and they respond by trying to summon more commitment, more willpower, more intensity. The exact strategy Chapter 6 already showed doesn't survive contact with a real life. The actual reason progress disappears is almost always structural, not motivational. A new pattern was built without a container sturdy enough to hold it once the initial attention that built it moved on to something else. Think of it this way. The first weeks of any change get supported by something temporary, novelty, enthusiasm, the fresh clarity of having just named a problem you'd carried unnamed for years. That temporary support is real, and it's genuinely useful for getting a new pattern off the ground. But it was never going to last, because nothing that runs on freshness stays fresh forever. The question that actually determines whether progress survives isn't whether you can generate enough enthusiasm to start something. It's whether you built anything sturdier than enthusiasm to hold it once the enthusiasm inevitably fades. Thoreau understood this at a structural level most people never reach. He didn't protect his deliberate life at Walden through daily bursts of inspired willpower. He protected it through actual physical and practical structure. A cabin built with his own hands. A bean field that required tending on a schedule the seasons enforced regardless of how he felt on any given morning. A strict accounting of expenses that made his relationship to necessity visible and impossible to drift away from unnoticed. The structure did the holding. His motivation on any single day was almost beside the point, because the system around him didn't depend on that day's motivation to keep functioning. Here is the distinction that explains almost every disappeared pattern you've ever experienced. There is a difference between a decision and a structure. A decision is something you make once, in a moment of clarity. And clarity, by its nature, doesn't last. A structure is something built once and then requires no fresh clarity to keep operating, because it operates on its own logic rather than on your daily willingness to redecide it. The unscheduled evening from Chapter 7 was a decision. It becomes a structure only once it has a fixed place on your calendar, a specific day, a specific time, treated with the same non-negotiable weight as an appointment you didn't get to choose. This is uncomfortable to hear because it sounds unglamorous, almost bureaucratic, compared to the emotional clarity of the moment you first decided to change. But structure is not the enemy of a deliberate life. It's the only thing that has ever actually protected one. The freedom you're building toward doesn't come from refusing all structure. It comes from choosing your structure deliberately, instead of living unexamined, inside a structure someone else built around you a long time ago. Notice, too, the specific moment progress tends to disappear, because the pattern is remarkably consistent. It isn't usually during a crisis when the stakes are high enough to keep your attention sharp. It's during an ordinary stretch, a week when nothing in particular is wrong, when the initial urgency that drove the change has faded and nothing has yet replaced it. This is the most dangerous window in any real change. Not the hard weeks, but the calm ones, because calm is exactly when structure gets treated as optional. Just this once, and just this once has a way of repeating itself until the structure has quietly disappeared entirely, unnoticed until months later when you realize the shoreline looks nothing like it did in spring. There is a further wrinkle worth naming because it explains why the calm week collapse feels so invisible while it's happening. A single skipped evening produces almost no discomfort at all, which is exactly what makes it dangerous. If skipping the structure once produced an immediate, sharp consequence, you'd correct course instantly. Instead, it produces nothing, no penalty, no visible cost, which quietly teaches the mind that the structure was optional after all. The real cost only shows up much later, assembled out of many individually costless skips. The same compounding logic the hidden cost chapter already introduced, now applied to the very structure meant to protect you from it. This is also why external accountability matters more than most people want to admit. A structure that exists only inside your own head can be silently renegotiated by that same head at 2 a.m, with nobody else present to notice the terms have changed. A structure that involves another person, even loosely, a friend who knows about the protected evening and asks how it's going and adds a layer that cannot be quietly talked out of existence by your own tired reasoning alone. This isn't a sign of weakness. It's simply an acknowledgement that the mind negotiating with itself in private has a documented tendency to grant itself exceptions it would never grant if someone else were in the room. There is a final piece worth naming before moving on. Structure and rigidity are not the same thing, and it's worth not confusing them. A protected evening that becomes a source of guilt on the one week it genuinely can't happen has drifted from structure into something closer to a new, smaller mechanism, punishing rather than protective. The structures worth building are the ones sturdy enough to hold across most weeks and flexible enough to bend occasionally without the whole system reading that bend as failure. The goal was never perfect adherence. It was a container reliable enough that most weeks don't require willpower to fill it, which leaves willpower available for the rare weeks that genuinely do. Protecting progress, then, isn't about generating more feeling. It's about building small, boring, durable mechanisms that don't depend on feeling to keep running. A specific evening blocked on a calendar, treated as immovable. A person you've told about the boundary, who will notice and ask if it quietly disappears. A floor version, built back in Chapter 9, ready to deploy the exact week your energy and motivation both happen to be at their lowest. None of these mechanisms are exciting. Their entire value lies in the fact that they don't need to be. You will lose the thread again at some point, even with structure in place. That isn't failure. It's what happens to every real pattern at some point across a real, ordinary, imperfect life. The difference structure makes isn't that the thread never gets dropped. It's that a structure gives you something specific to pick back up. A known evening, a known boundary, a known floor version, rather than having to rebuild the entire pattern from raw motivation every single time it slips. That difference, small and unglamorous as it sounds, is the entire distance between a change that was real once and a change that actually lasts. Chapter 13. The Mechanism of Identity. How repeated ordinary action quietly rewrites the story you tell about who you are. Something has been quietly shifting underneath everything covered so far, and it's time to name it directly. You have not just been protecting evenings, holding boundaries, and building floor versions of a better pattern. You have been, action by action, deciding who you actually are, as opposed to who you were simply defaulting into being. This chapter is about that shift, because at some point a structure stops being a system you follow and starts being a description of the person you've become. And that transition is where lasting change actually completes itself. Consider the mechanics of how identity forms in the first place, because most people have this backward. The common assumption is that you first become a certain kind of person, and then that identity produces the matching behavior. Someone believes they're disciplined, and so they act with discipline. In practice, it runs the other direction far more often than people realize. The action comes first, repeated enough times, and the identity gets assembled afterward. As a kind of summary, the mind writes to explain a pattern of behavior it has already observed enough times to trust. You do not think your way into a new identity. You act your way into one small repeated choice at a time, until the mind finally updates its account of who you are to match what you've actually been doing. This is why the unglamorous structure from the last chapter matters more than it first appeared to. Every time you protect the evening, instead of defaulting to the phone, you are not just managing that single evening. You are supplying one more piece of evidence to the part of your mind that keeps score, quietly building a case, action by action, for a different verdict about who you fundamentally are. One evening protected proves very little on its own. 10 evenings protected start to look like a pattern. 50 evenings protected stop looking like an effort you're making and start looking like simply who you are, no different in kind from any other fact about yourself that no longer requires conscious deciding. Thoreau lived this exact mechanism in reverse of how most people imagine it. He didn't arrive at the pond already being the deliberate, self-sufficient man history remembers. He became that man through 2 years of small, repeated, often unglamorous actions, chopping wood, tending beans, keeping careful account of every expense, actions that individually proved very little but that accumulated, day after day, into a person genuinely different from the one who had walked into the woods. He wrote about wanting to live deliberately as a starting intention. But the deliberate life itself was not the intention. It was the eventual identity, built slowly, out of nothing more dramatic than sustained, repeated action. Here is the distinction that makes this chapter matter more than it might first seem to. There is a difference between having a habit and having an identity built from that habit. A habit is something you do. An identity is something you no longer have to decide to do, because the decision has already been absorbed into a settled sense of who you are. This distinction explains why the first weeks of any change feel so effortful, and the later months, if the pattern survives that long, start to feel almost automatic in the opposite direction from where they began. You're not becoming more disciplined in some abstract sense. You're accumulating enough evidence that your own mind has quietly stopped arguing with the behavior and started simply expecting it of you. This mechanism cuts both directions, and it's worth being honest about the second one. Every evening you don't protect, every boundary you quietly let slide, is also evidence, feeding the opposite case, reinforcing the older identity. This entire narrative has been trying to help you exit. This isn't meant to induce anxiety about every single lapse. A single missed evening proves as little in this direction as a single protected one proves in the other. What matters is the overall ratio across weeks and months, which identity is accumulating more evidence, not which single day happened to go one way or the other. Notice, too, a specific and often unexpected consequence of this shift once it's underway. Decisions that used to require real deliberation start requiring almost none. You used to have to talk yourself into the unscheduled evening, weighing arguments for and against it every single time. At some point, usually without a specific moment you can point to, the weighing simply stops happening. Protecting the evening becomes the default, and it's the old pattern, if it tries to reassert itself, that now requires the deliberate argument and conscious override. This reversal, when it arrives, is one of the clearest signs that identity, not just behavior, has actually changed underneath you. There is a quiet test worth applying to yourself here, more reliable than trying to judge progress by how motivated you feel on any given day. Notice what you say, out loud or silently, when someone asks you to fill an evening you'd normally protect. If the answer requires real internal negotiation, the old identity is still doing most of the deciding. If the answer arrives almost before the question finishes, something closer to "that's not something I do anymore," the new identity has taken over the account, and the negotiation you used to have to win every single time has simply stopped being necessary. There's a specific moment worth watching for, because it tends to arrive with almost no warning. It's the moment someone describes you, to your face or to someone else within earshot, using language that matches the new pattern rather than the old one. She always protects her evenings now. He doesn't really do the constant availability thing anymore. The first time you hear this, something lands differently than any private sense of progress could. Other people's descriptions of you are, in their own way, a kind of external confirmation that the internal case has already been won, whether or not you'd fully registered the verdict yourself yet. You are, right now, in the middle of exactly this accumulation, whether or not it feels that way yet. Every evening from the past several chapters, every boundary held under resistance, every floor version deployed on a depleted day, has been quietly building a case your own mind is still in the process of accepting. The case isn't finished. It rarely finishes all at once. But it is real, and it is compounding in a direction you chose, action by action, rather than in the direction that was simply handed to you by inheritance, habit, and a mechanism that never once asked your permission to keep running. This is what it actually means to become the kind of person who lives deliberately. Not a sudden transformation, arriving complete on a single decisive day. A slow accumulation of ordinary, repeated choices, each one small enough to seem insignificant alone, adding up quietly and without asking for credit, into a person your own mind eventually has no choice but to recognize as genuinely, permanently different from who walked into this narrative 15 chapters ago. Chapter 14. Consolidation. All 14 pieces, finally seen as one coherent system rather than 13 separate struggles. Everything this narrative has walked through so far has arrived as a separate piece, examined one at a time, because that's the only way any of it could actually be absorbed. The first sign, the denial that kept it invisible, the pattern finally named, the mechanism underneath the pattern, its hidden cost, why past attempts to fix it collapsed, the first real move, small enough to survive contact with an actual week, the resistance that met it, the floor version built for the days nothing else was available, the relationships recalibrating around the change, the root beneath all of it, inherited rather than chosen. Why progress disappears without structure, the identity slowly assembling itself out of repeated ordinary action. Each piece was necessary. None of them, alone, was sufficient. This chapter is where they finally become one system, coherent enough to actually rely on. Picture, for a moment, the full shape rather than the individual parts. A person notices the first sign, a lost afternoon, a hollow feeling with no obvious cause. Instead of translating that discomfort into distraction, the way denial usually manages it, they let themselves actually see it. Seeing it clearly enough gives the pattern a name, and naming it separates the person from the pattern for the first time, turning something that felt like identity into something that can finally be examined as separate from identity. Examining it honestly reveals the mechanism running underneath, the inherited schedule, the retroactive meanings, the constant distraction preventing a clear look at either. Understanding the mechanism makes the hidden cost visible, no longer an abstraction but an actual calculation, hours spent, years compounding, a bill that had been accumulating in silence for longer than anyone wanted to admit. From there, the past attempts get revisited honestly, not as proof of failure, but as data, information about exactly which strategies don't survive real conditions, symptom-focused change, isolated change, change launched too large to be funded by finite motivation. That information shapes the first real move, deliberately small, sized for a bad week rather than a good one. The resistance that meets the first move gets recognized for what it actually is, not a signal to stop, but the old pattern's last and loudest argument, usually loosening within minutes if simply outlasted rather than obeyed. A floor version gets built in advance, ready for the depleted days that would otherwise undo everything, because a system that only works when energy is high was never going to survive an actual life. The relational recalibration happens alongside all of this, not before it and not after, because other people were never separate from the change to begin with. Some relationships adjust and even find their own permission in watching yours unfold. Others resist, and the resistance gets met with honesty, rather than either total capitulation or unnecessary cruelty. Underneath the entire structure, the oldest root finally gets acknowledged. The inherited belief that busyness proves worth, examined enough to be separated from the people who passed it down with love, and set down without that setting down requiring any rejection of them. And then, almost invisibly, without a single dramatic day marking the transition, structure protects the pattern long enough for repeated action to accumulate into something no longer requiring conscious decision at all. Identity forms, not because it was declared, but because it was built, evening by evening, boundary by boundary, floor version by floor version, until the mind had no honest choice left but to update its account of who its person had become. This is the full system, and notice what makes it different from every fragmented attempt that came before it. It has no single weak point where the entire structure depends on one part holding perfectly. The mechanism can be understood even on a day the resistance feels overwhelming. The floor version can be deployed even on a day the relationships feel strained. The oldest root can remain only partially examined while the newer structure still holds the daily pattern in place. Each piece supports the others, which means no single bad day, bad week, or unexamined corner is enough to collapse the whole arrangement, the way a single missed resolution used to collapse an entire attempt built on nothing but initial motivation. It's worth naming, too, why this redundancy matters more than any single piece's individual strength. A system built from one strong pillar collapses completely the moment that pillar fails. A system built from many interlocking moderately strong pieces can lose several at once and still hold, because the remaining pieces were never depending on the failed ones to begin with. This is not a small technical difference. It is the entire reason the fragmented attempts documented in Chapter 6 kept collapsing, and the entire reason this consolidated version is built to survive an ordinary, imperfect life instead of only a carefully controlled one. It's worth naming, too, why this redundancy matters more than any single piece's individual strength. A system built from one strong pillar collapses completely the moment that pillar fails. A system built from many interlocking, moderately strong pieces can lose several at once and still hold, because the remaining pieces were never depending on the failed ones to begin with. This is not a small technical difference. It is the entire reason the fragmented attempts documented in Chapter 6 kept collapsing, and the entire reason this consolidated version is built to survive an ordinary, imperfect life, instead of only a carefully controlled one. There is one more way to picture the whole system that might make it easier to trust going forward. Think less of a single chain, which is only as strong as its weakest link, and more of a woven fabric where each thread crosses several others, and no individual thread is load-bearing on its own. Cut one thread in a chain, and the whole thing separates. Cut one thread in a fabric, and the fabric barely notices, because the strength was never concentrated in any single strand to begin with. 14 chapters were never 14 separate chains. They were 14 threads, and the weaving between them, the way the resistance chapter informs the low-energy chapter, the way the relational chapter supports the identity chapter, is where the actual strength has been living the entire time. Thoreau, in his second year at the pond, wrote with a settledness entirely absent from his early weeks there, no longer describing the restlessness that had marked his first attempts at this same deliberate life. Something had consolidated in him by then, not because the individual pieces changed, but because they had finally been in place long enough, together, to become load-bearing rather than experimental. He wasn't performing a deliberate life anymore by that point. He was simply living inside one, the way a person eventually stops noticing the weight of a structure that has proven, through enough repetition, that it can actually hold. You are closer to that consolidation than it probably feels most days. Every piece named across these 14 chapters exists somewhere in your own recent experience, however imperfectly applied so far. The task remaining isn't to master any single piece further. It's to trust that the pieces, held together, are already forming the system this chapter has just described, whether or not you've had the language until now to recognize it as one coherent structure instead of 13 separate struggles. One chapter remains. It won't ask you to learn anything new. It will ask you to recognize what has already, quietly, become true. Chapter 15. The new way of seeing remains. The open loop closes. What you now carry, you carry permanently. Go back, for a moment, to the beginning of this narrative. The phone checked before your feet touched the floor. The coffee going cold in the other room. The question that opened everything. What would your days look like if you actually decided how to spend them, instead of discovering how they were spent, the way you discover a bank balance after the money is already gone? And underneath that, the deeper question the hook planted and never answered. It was never really about what you do with your time. It was about what you do with what's left of you after the time runs out. Here, finally, is the answer. And it will not surprise you, because you have been building it, chapter by chapter, for longer than you've had these exact words to describe it. What's left of you after the time runs out is not a mystery waiting to be solved on some future day. It is being decided right now. In the evening you protect or don't, the boundary you hold or quietly abandon, the honest 10 minutes you sit through instead of filling with noise. There was never a future moment when the answer would finally arrive. The answer has been arriving the entire time. In the accumulation of small, repeated choices, this narrative has spent 14 chapters teaching you to notice. Thoreau closed his own account of Walden with a sentence that has outlived nearly everyone who first read it. And it survives because it names something true rather than something merely hopeful. He wrote that if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer, and that he should step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. Read this now at the end of your own version of the same walk, and notice how different it sounds from the first time this idea might have crossed your path, back when it was still an abstraction rather than something you'd actually practiced. You have heard the different drummer by now, even if it arrived quietly. Even if most weeks it was barely audible under the noise of an ordinary life, still doing its ordinary work around you. You heard it in the lost Sunday that first cracked the surface. You heard it more clearly once the pattern had a name, once the mechanism had visible parts, once the hidden cost had an actual number attached to it, instead of a vague, avoided feeling. You have been stepping to that different measure for 14 chapters now, imperfectly, inconsistently, exactly the way any real person steps to anything. And the imperfection was never the disqualifying failure it once felt like. It was simply what practice looks like from the inside, before enough repetition turns it into identity. Here is what changes permanently. And this is the part earlier chapters could only point toward, because it can only actually be understood from where you're standing now, at the end rather than the beginning. You will not go back to not seeing this. That is the real inheritance of everything covered here, more durable than any single evening protected, or any single boundary held. Once the first sign has been named, once the mechanism has been seen clearly enough to recognize its parts, the old blindness simply isn't available to you anymore, even on the days you'd honestly prefer it were. You can still choose the old pattern on any given evening. You can no longer choose it by accident, without noticing, the way you did before this narrative started. That difference, seeing versus not seeing, is the entire distance between a life that happens to you and a life you actually author, and it cannot be unlearned once it's been learned. Consider what this means for the days ahead, that this narrative will not be there to walk you through individually. There will be evenings you fail to protect. There will be weeks the floor version doesn't get deployed, resistance you don't outlast, an old relationship dynamic that pulls you back into availability, mistaken for connection. None of this undoes what has actually changed. The measure of a deliberate life was never perfect execution. It was the seeing, sustained across imperfect execution, that keeps bringing you back to the choice instead of letting the choice disappear entirely beneath old habit. You will drift. Everyone drifts. What you now have, permanently, is the capacity to notice the drift and correct it, rather than only discovering years later how far you'd traveled from anything you actually chose. Thoreau eventually left the pond, and he was honest about why, writing that he left for as good a reason as he went there, because he had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. This detail matters more than it first appears to. The point was never the cabin itself, and it was never really about the woods. The point was the seeing he'd built there, portable, permanent, carried forward into whatever came next, because a way of seeing once genuinely built does not require the original conditions that built it in order to keep operating. You do not need a pond. You never did. What you needed was exactly what these 15 chapters have been building in you the entire time, evening by evening. An internal structure sturdy enough to keep choosing deliberately, regardless of which external conditions show up around it. This is the open-loop closing, the one planted quietly at the very start of this narrative and left unresolved through every chapter since. The question was never truly about your time. It was about what would be left standing once the borrowed hours were finally accounted for, once the denial stopped translating discomfort into distraction, once the mechanism had been seen clearly enough to no longer run unattended. What remains now is not a finished project. It is a way of seeing that does not switch off, carried forward into a life that will keep offering you the exact same choice day after ordinary day, for as long as you're alive to make it. There is nothing left to explain that hasn't already been explained across the 14 chapters behind this one. What remains is simpler than explanation. It is practice, repeated across years you haven't lived yet, in evenings you haven't protected yet, under resistance you haven't outlasted yet. The narrative ends here. The life it described does not, and was never going to, because a deliberate life isn't a destination this account could deliver you to. It's a way of walking that you now know how to continue on your own, long after these particular words have stopped being the ones doing the walking for you. So return, one last time, to that cold cup of coffee in the other roof, the image this narrative opened with. It is still there, in a sense. It will always be there, symbolically, on any morning you let the day begin without deciding anything about it first. But you are not the same person standing at that doorway anymore. You know now what the coldness actually meant. And you know, with a clarity the opening pages could only gesture toward, that the question was never whether you'd walk back in and drink it out of habit. The question was always whether you would notice, and choosing to notice again and again, small evening after small evening, is the whole of what a deliberate life actually turns out to be. You noticed. That is not the beginning of the work. After 15 chapters, walked honestly, it is already, quietly, irreversibly, the work itself. Walden Time. A narrative based on Walden by Henry David Thoreau.